Hi, I'm Jason Sachs, writer of the American Comic Book Chronicles, the 1990s,
And I'm Keith Dallas, the editor-in-chief of the American Comic Book Chronicles series.
and we are on Mr. Media.
In the 1990s, there were a lot of comic books and comic book publishers that I either missed out on completely or that held so little appeal to me that I ignored them. Now, that's saying a lot for a guy who lived for Wednesdays, New Comic Book Day in America, through the late 1960s, all of the 70s, and much of the 80s. I do know it was a time of greatness for the medium. Alex Ross, Kurt Busiek, Neil Gaiman, Frank Miller, Jim Lee, Alan Moore, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, among others, who turned the medium on its ass and spun it round and round. Me? Well, I got married in 88, started writing books in 92, had a kid in 96. So I have a damn good excuse for sleeping through this particular sequential art revolution. I had a life. Ha! Fortunately, the folks at Tomorrow's Publishing have embarked on a massive effort to qualify and quantify comic books of every era with their American Comic Book Chronicles series. Joining me today to talk about the latest volume, the 90s, are author Jason Sachs and editor-in-chief Keith Dallas. This is their second appearance on the show. The guys were last here to talk about the 1970s edition. So Jason Sachs and Keith Dallas, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Good to have you guys here. And before I start, I want to just point out to folks who are watching the video of this interview that only Jason is visible on screen.
Hello.
There he is. Keith prefers the shadows, like some Image comic supervillain from the 1990s. Guys, why don't we start with each of you giving a reason why 1990s comics are as good or better than any other decade. Jason?
You described the 1990s earlier as a revolution, and the 90s were a revolutionary era in comics. It was a brief moment in time when it seemed like Marvel and DC, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man were passé, where characters like Youngblood, Bloodshot, characters from the Ultraverse and comics' greatest world could be the latest hot new thing that the entire world seemed to be turning upside down. It was fun to chronicle an era of great optimism followed by an incredible amount of pessimism as the industry collapsed from its heights.
Keith?
I'm being tasked with asking why 1990s comic books are better than any other decade?
As good as or better.
I mean, if you know, as is stated in the introduction to the book, I think you have to compare the best to the best. And I think part of the problem when we talk about the 1990s comic book industry is people immediately look to the worst of 1990s comic books. They look to like some of the worst, like say Image comic books where it's all splash pages, or there were several years where Marvel there we go, there's culprit number one, there's state's evidence number one. Or when Marvel was absolutely just flooding the market, and there was not enough talent to really produce enough quality books. Those were some pretty bad books. But if you look at things, like Mike Mignola's Hellboy, that's sort of my favorite of the 1990s comic books. I think you can hold Hellboy up to, you could argue it's in the top 10, top 20 of all comic books produced. Original, has atmosphere. It's no one. I'd like to meet the person who said it's a bad that Hellboy is a bad comic book. So that's how I would defend 1990s comic books. That if we look at the best, and you mentioned some important names: Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Garth Ennis started his career in the 1990s. Jeff Johns started his career in 1999. So to make some blanket statements that, 1990s comic books were the worst comic books ever produced in the history of the medium, I think is just silly. I mean, again, as you mentioned, Jason and I worked on the 1970s volume, and he and I both can attest there are some really bad comic books that were published in the 1970s. So, but I think what you saw in the 1990s is that the market conditions allowed for a comic book like Hellboy. Hellboy could not have been produced in a decade, or could not have been started in a decade other than the 1990s.
So let me ask you this. What did this emerging generation of comics creators in the 90s understand about the medium, perhaps, that their predecessors did not? Is there anything?
I think there's two pieces to that. One is they grew up knowing that Jack Kirby didn't get the rights to the Fantastic Four, Thor, and the other creations, and they wanted to blaze their own trails and make their own money creating their comics that really meant something to them. One of the big events of the 90s that starts out in the very first chapter is in 1991, Todd McFarlane released Spider-Man #1 through Marvel, sold 2.35 million copies, and he suddenly was a rock star in the medium. And he realized very quickly that he's not going to make as much money as he wants to drawing other people's characters. He had to create his own character and exploit what turned out to be Spawn for his own gain. And whereas the previous generation, someone like Kirby may have sold a character like Spawn to Marvel or given it to Marvel, instead McFarlane said, no, I'm going to do this myself. For all his faults, someone like Rob Liefeld did the same thing, Jim Lee with Wildcats, and went turned into the Wildstorm universe. So I think there's a lot more awareness that creating your own world is going to allow you to own the intellectual property and really be able to make the money that you need to make from it, that you deserve to make from it. And you see that with Hellboy and with the other book that I think is the most transcendent of the 1990s, Usagi Yojimbo, which ran throughout the decade. I think they also learned the lesson of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which had come out just a few years before, and they saw Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird make a crazy amount of money. The other thing is they realized that comics had this kind of almost infinite amount of potential, that they could produce really anything of high quality and have some opportunity to gain an audience. There's a great graphic novel from 1990 called Enemy Ace War Idol by George Pratt. That's just gorgeous and an amazing exploration of World War I that's just drawn in this spectacular art style, up to Marvels by Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross. At the time, Alex Ross was a completely unknown talent, and they kind of persuaded Marvel to put out a book like that. So I think creators in the 90s especially have a greater sense of what they were able to create, how they were able to create it, and had the feeling that they could kind of transform the industry to accept books that were more artistically driven.
Keith, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Jason, put that very well. I think if I have anything to add, it's that we're in the 1990s. We're now looking at an almost exclusively direct market type of industry. Where obviously comic books are still being sold on the newsstand, but both not only the independent publishers, but even Marvel and DC, a much greater percentage of their sales are coming from the specialty comic book stores, which allows for greater creative risks to be taken. Obviously, higher price point, greater profit. So it's to me, again, the 1990s I think gets a really bad rap as this decade that should be forgotten. And I mean, even John Morrow would joke about it with me, as when we in the initial stages of this larger project, where he said, I think he even joked like, do we have to publish a book in the 1990s? And I said,
Right.
well, I was like, hey, come on, John, but so.
No, in fact, you resisted it, Keith, when I was pitching it to you.
Yeah, it's and we could say that the print run and the pre-orders are right up there. It's with the other volumes. It's not like the 1990s volume took this drastic. There was this drastic reduction in pre-orders. It's right up there with all the other volumes.
No, I actually think that this is the right time for a book about the 1990s. I mean, we're just about to get into 2019, which means that the last of the books we cover is 20 years old now.
Yeah.
For kids who picked those books up when they were 14 or 16 years old, they're now in their 30s and feeling tremendous nostalgia for that era. And it's important for us to commemorate it and deliver something that's kind of an unbiased history of that era.
They're also feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders, and life is collapsing as they know it. And well, I don't want to depress those kids too much. Let me come back for a second. I want to talk about the direct market in a few minutes, but let's talk about the 90s was really the era, I think, of creator-owned properties, right? That's kind of what you were getting at, Jason. I mean,
Right.
because the kids growing up in the 70s and 80s, they heard the stories about Kirby. They saw Siegel and Schuster have to beg and borrow to stay alive because DC and Warner Communications were making all this money off of Superman and all the Superman characters, and they were getting nothing until Neil Adams stepped in.
Right.
And Marvel, same thing. I mean, really, even Stan Lee really didn't own a piece of any of the characters that he created. He eventually was getting an annual amount of money from Marvel, but it took years and a lot of legal to get people who created other characters to start getting some money from that. So is the big lesson of the 90s for these creators that they had to own their properties, or they had to have a royalty agreement if they were going to work for DC and Marvel? They knew that there was money out there, that it wasn't a nickel and dime industry anymore.
There's a lot of wisdom gained from Kirby, but I think also from the Ninja Turtles. The overnight success of the Turtles and the amazing windfall of money that Eastman and Laird earned from the Turtles, I think really informed every approach they took to the medium, such that, when something like Jim Lee's Wildcats came out, Lee made sure to keep his copyright and, drive his own characters. A lot of these characters are now forgotten, but Lee owned them, and that's an important thing. He was able to really exploit them himself at the time, and it was true for all the image creators and really for many of the creators who came afterwards as well. To the extent of someone like Chris Claremont had a series for DC called Sovereign 7 that was tightly negotiated with lawyers such that he was able to keep a great amount of the copyright and royalty money from the series. Happened to hit at a time that the book didn't sell as well as anyone had hoped. But to this day, Claremont basically owns that property, even though those characters appeared in the DC universe and crossed over with DC characters. And I think that's the true revolution of the 1990s, that creators began to really get the equity that they deserved for the characters that they created.
So for anyone watching or listening, wondering how long it was going to take Bob Andelman to bring up Will Eisner's name, I think the winner would say about 14, 15 minutes into the interview. I showed as much restraint as I could. What I'm wondering is, Eisner, was he a guiding star for any of these creators in the 90s, in that he was the guy who always held on to his rights, or at least when he sold his rights to things like Sheena and Uncle Sam and Black Hawks, things like that, he made money off of it, but he the Spirit, I guess, is the example of something he held on to all those years. He showed that there was money in reprints and spin-offs and all that kind of thing. Did he matter at this point to the 90s, or was it really more Laird and Eastman that they were aware of because of the huge time that had passed?
I wish I could give Eisner more credit in this era, and I'm a big Eisner fan myself. But I think it was really spurred on as much by anything as the fact that they just were flush with money from their Marvel deals and said, we want to have more of this. Marvel doesn't deserve to own all our money. And it was that kind of realization.
Jack Kirby
Keith,
was the rallying cry. Jack
yeah,
Kirby
and Kirby.
was for the image founders. Jack Kirby was their icon that they held up and said, we're not going to become the next Jack Kirby whose creations are just stolen from us by the corporations. I just looked, Bob, and Will Eisner does not appear in the index in the 1990s volume. So, which is obviously not to say that he's irrelevant. I mean, he's Will Eisner, but I guess, to answer your question is no, he's not being directly referenced by, say, the Image founders or by other creators who are, blazing their own path.
Well, Keith, let me flip that around and ask you this: are the '90s creators responsible for? I mean, we've had the last 10 years of Marvel movies, for example, and now DC movies. The Aquaman movie, just as we're recording this, the Aquaman movie's been out only a couple days, and I understand at the end. I saw the movie. I forgot to check the credits, but I understand at the end there are 10 different Aquaman comics creators who are mentioned in the credits, including like Nick Cardy and people like that.
Ford Weisinger, I think, as well, right?
Yeah, and so are the '90s creators? Do they get some credit for the fact that these guys, and it's mostly men at this point, that they're getting some recognition and maybe some cash? Is it because of the guys in the '90s who fought, for creators' rights and for their own, obviously for their own rights and their own money?
Yeah, I mean, as much as the Image creators, get, taken to task, I think, for some of their early releases, which the quality of which we can debate. There's no question that they brought that issue to the forefront and just said, look, the creators deserve their piece of the pie. Would you agree, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they were the real force that led people to realize the creators were important, that they were really the most vital piece.
I was thinking about, I don't know why this name comes to mind so much, but Gary Friedrich, who created Ghost Rider, got some money finally at long last. The last couple of years, Ghost Rider became a character on S.H.I.E.L.D. on TV of all things, and then suddenly they gave him some money. He got some recognition, but it took forever for that.
Yeah, I worked a little bit for Dave Cockrum before he passed away when the first X-Men movie came out, for him to get royalties for Nightcrawler. It's a tragic story with him as well. I mean, he had a series of terrible health problems and really only got any money from Marvel towards the end of his life, in the last year or two of his life.
He was like in a VA hospital at the end there, Jason, wasn't he?
Yeah, he had actually one leg amputated, and he was living in a VA hospital in New Jersey, as I understand, a pretty rotten place to be. And Clifford Meth led the effort to really help him get a reasonable royalty out of the characters.
Yeah.
Now, what about on the? So we were talking about the business side, but I want to come back to the creative side of the '90s comics and this group. The other thing that struck me is that the writers and artists who were creating in the '90s, whatever their age might be, their 20s or 30s, maybe even in their 40s. This is a group that grew up with comic books as a part of the cultural fabric of the United States and I guess the world in a way that no generation had before, I think. Is that safe to say?
I think so. That's an interesting point. I think that they grew up expecting that comics would be around and that would be a popular medium and art form that they could really be part of as a career. And there were plenty of pioneers who were continuing to work in the field for many years. One of the main stories we tell in the book is about the rise and fall of Valiant Comics, which of course was led by Jim Shooter in its early years. And Shooter hired a lot of veteran creators, Don Perlin among others, to work for him. And I think he kind of showed that there's a career to be made and money to be made in creating comics that people love.
What? So let's break down a couple of the companies for a minute, and maybe some of the independents. What were the big hits and misses? Because people know Marvel, they know DC, so we can't ignore them. What were some of the big hits and misses of the '90s for Marvel, for example?
Well, the story actually I was going to tell was, you're talking about hits and misses.
Yeah.
My favorite story about hits and misses in the '90s is the day that the death of Superman was announced, it's a famous day, of course, there were lines around the block at Golden Apple Comics in Los Angeles. And what people don't talk about, and which I found in Old Comics Buyer's Guide, is that there were actually 2 lines around the block that day.
Yep.
One line was to get copies of the death of Superman. The other was to get copies of Deadshot.
Yep.
Deadshot number. I always get the Dead and Bloods.
No, actually, it's Bloodshot. It's
Bloodshot number
right.
1 from Valiant Comics with this beautiful hollow foil cover. I think it was $275 cover price. They sold 850,000 copies of that book on that day.
Wow.
And that was Don Perlin. You just mentioned Don Perlin. Don Perlin.
Yes. That book. Yeah. Several months later, they sold 1.75 million copies of Turok Dinosaur Hunter number 1.
Yeah.
Which also had a hollow foil cover. Now the legend is that they sold those to retailers, but maybe 10% of those actually were bought by readers. And of course, to this day, you can still find copies in great shape at quarter bins at your local comic convention. But they were hits, and they made massive amounts of money for companies like Valiant. Another one of my favorite stories is. This is maybe apocryphal, but Jim Lee created Wildstorm Studios, which of course eventually was bought by DC. But in '92, they were their own freestanding company, and they were so flush with money that Jim Lee bought his staff sports cars that year, some of which were promptly wrecked, and people just walked away and said, "Easy come, easy go. This will happen again next year." So. It was just insane amounts of money floating around the industry in the early days. Maybe my favorite story about hits and misses, though, was Marvel's number 1. We're used to now thinking about Marvel's number 1 or the Marvel's limited series from 94, I believe it was, as being this predestined hit, one of the classics of the industry. But reading old magazines of the time revealed that this is a big risk for Marvel. They had no idea this was going to be a hit. Busiek was a very obscure name, and Ross had really only done 1 book before. So they had no idea this kind of retro-feeling story about real-world people interacting with superheroes would have any measure of popularity, and they dramatically underprinted it to the point where the book just sold through and kept being reprinted and reprinted to the point where at one point there was like 750,000 copies in print at a time the market was very down. And it's just a remarkable achievement and a remarkable fact that sometimes quality really did win out.
I guess one of the things I was thinking about was that this was the era, though, speaking of Marvel, of kind of the X-Men expansion. Yeah. And it just, I think I made a note to myself that it went way beyond what I ever needed to read or cared to read.
Yeah.
Did anybody else feel that way?
Well, and Bob, I think it's not just limited to the X-Men. I think that's Marvel's sin of that decade is you name a property, and if it became popular, suddenly one title would mushroom into 12, 3 ongoings and half a dozen one-shots and special. You see that with X-Men. You see that with the Punisher. You see that with Spider-Man. It's truly an indication of the suits taking over Marvel and looking at the sales figures and saying, oh, wow, Spider-Man's hot. Let's put out 50,000 different Spider-Man titles because obviously everybody wants, the majority of readers want Spider-Man, so let's give them what they want. And that's, I remember when we were doing the 80s volume, that for the longest time, Jim Shooter would not greenlight a second X-Men title because now granted, of course, there was New Mutants and things like that, which is really more of a spin-off than say a second X-Men title. But he didn't want to sort of dilute the quality of the series. He didn't want to, essentially kill the golden goose, and particularly with a property like Punisher. Beginning, early 1990s, very popular. He's even part of that substitute Fantastic Four. No, he wasn't part of they wanted him to be part of that substitute Fantastic Four with Wolverine and Spider-Man and Hulk. Who was the fourth one in that, Jason? It was
Ghost Rider.
Ghost Rider, thank you. And so, but then, now by, 93, 94, he's got like 4 or 5 titles, and then his popularity quickly fizzles from that point on. And then you couldn't sell, Marvel couldn't sell, by the end of that decade, really couldn't sell the Punisher at all.
And can I say that I never need to hear another word about spider clones?
Oh, I never need to read another Spider Clone comic either. Oh, man. That was the most painful part of the writing of this darn book.
Can you believe that went on and on and on and on? There was ever even a debate about whether that storyline should have continued. I do remember that. I remember occasionally going to the comic book store and looking and going, they're still doing this? Oh my God.
Here's the final issue of the Spider Clone saga, which was the biggest relief of anything I read as part of this book. Yeah, well, that's a great example of the suits taking over at Marvel too, and guiding what the creators were doing, because the Spider Clone saga began in, I believe, 94 as just a little 4-part storyline. They just thought it would be fun to kind of goose the sales of Spider-Man by teasing that the Spider Clone still lived. But for various reasons, the sales picked up almost immediately. The first couple issues that had the Spider Clone actually sold quite well. And the suits said, basically, keep this going. This is getting people excited. And so it dragged on and on, brought in all these crazy supporting characters, and the machinations just continued forever. And then 95, they were ready. Okay, we're a year in. We want to close this saga out. No, we don't want to do anything anymore with this. And then Marvel Suits said, no, we don't want anything to distract from Heroes Reborn, which is another one of Marvel's great fiascos of the time. So we're going to keep the storyline going and going and going. So yeah, they end up running, I think, over 2 years.
And then the decision to make Ben Reilly the real Spider-Man, and then realizing that was a huge mistake. Oh, no, just joking. Peter Parker is really the true Spider-Man. So that just extended it even more. Dan Jurgens said, yeah, no mas, I'm going back to DC.
Well, and the crazy thing is, as we're sitting here this week, it's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the animated film, is in its second week. And the whole point of that is that you can have all these different Spider-Man characters. Miles Morales, my 5-year-old nephew saw the movie last Friday, and I saw him on Saturday. I said, so who's your favorite Spider-Man? He said, oh, Miles Morales, he's the best. And I'm just like, and my son, who's 22, saw the movie 2 nights ago and said, oh my God, I love Miles Morales. And so it's interesting that they blew it on the Spider Clone 20 years ago, but somebody figured out how to do it right later on.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned Heroes Reborn. I have to ask about this because it fits a couple of the things we've talked about. Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld actually, basically, their studios each took over two series.
Yep.
And they basically rebooted the whole thing, and they were getting paid a huge amount of money by Marvel to do this, and it was exciting for a bit, and then it all just, I don't know how it blew up, and they eventually
fizzled out.
They had to just explain it as it was a pocket universe, and it was, oh my God, I'm describing the way I remember it, that it seemed like it was very exciting at first. You wanted to see what was going to happen, and then they just didn't seem to know what the hell they were doing, and it all blew up, and they had to, stop me anytime here, guys.
Bob, for someone who claims he didn't pay attention to comics in the 90s, you nailed that exactly right. That's pretty much exactly what happened. Liefeld and Lee came in. Their studios delivered these titles. For a very short time, it looked like, especially Avengers and Iron Man, were going to be hot books. People almost immediately rebelled against Liefeld's redesign of Captain America's costume, specifically removing the A from his head mask and replacing it with an eagle. Yeah, one of the funny things is reading the hype from the era is clear that Marvel, the powers that be at Marvel, were seeking out these creators for at least a year before they actually signed these contracts. And they were taking a calculated bet, basically, that they would gain the popularity of Image Comics from getting them to do this work for them. Not even thinking about the fact that Image Comics at that point were kind of fading. They were selling even like a tenth of what they'd sold 2 or 3 years previously. But there was this feeling that we got to try something different because no one's paying attention to these characters. The Avengers were in this terrible era. The Avengers the Crossing, which was the big crossover event of 1995 on the Avengers, was unreadable, just awful, one of the worst comics of the 90s, and exactly what people think of when they think of the 90s. And so no one was buying the book, and so they had to kind of throw a Hail Mary to bring the image creators back in and have them produce this work. Some of it's not terrible. James Robinson wrote a few issues for it. Jeff Loeb wrote some as well that aren't quite as good. But those first issues, especially the ones that Liefeld draws, are pretty spectacular.
Well,
It's an interesting choice of
I need to switch us over to DC because DC had a lot of interesting things going on. Batman met Bane. Superman went head to head with Doomsday and ended up, spoiler alert, dead. What do you guys make of DC in the 90s? What's the overall take on that?
I think the word is panic.
Really?
Okay, so there's kind of two key events for DC in the 1990s. One is the death of Superman, Batman having his bat broken, Green Lantern going crazy with the destruction of Oa, the Robin limited series with the holographic covers, Green Arrow gets killed. There's a lot of like stressing out about things getting all messed up in their universe. At the same time, in 1993, they launched Vertigo with Sandman Mystery Theater, Swamp Thing, a whole Doom Patrol, a whole line of really adult-focused comics, and that line sold better than they ever could have expected it to sell. It was sold like it was a blockbuster intake at the time. So this weird era where the superhero half of DC was really stressed out. They were very big on their annual events, some of which are great, some of which are unreadable, and seemed to be just in fear of the main Marvel, especially Image and Valiant, eating their lunch. And on the other hand, they're producing this work that really people still read today and love today. Sandman may be the best-selling book of its era. So it's DC was in a weird state at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that to piggyback off what Jason just said is it seems like DC was making a concerted effort to bring in the next generation of DC heroes, so like with the Tim Drake Robin, like with I forget who the second Green Arrow is.
Connor Hawke.
Thank you. Connor Hawke with Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern. I mean, there's clearly hero after hero after hero, the passing of the baton. I mean, obviously, Wally West became the Flash in the 80s, but Mark Waid writes this great Flash story arc, which at the time was meant to answer the question of, is Barry Allen coming back, with a definitive no, he's never coming back. Wally West is your Flash. Get used to it. Accept it. The only thing you're going to get is someone is Professor Zoom trying to impersonate Barry Allen. But very much in line with, Wally West is this generation's Flash. And to go with Connor Hawke as Green Arrow, Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern. And, I mean, obviously now, that's more of a 21st century story about how all of those characters would become replaced by their predecessors. But, I mean, you do see, it's interesting, Jason used the word panic. That's an interesting choice of word.
Yeah, I'm not sure I stand behind that. I just feel like they did feel like a need to make the characters relevant. We saw that with like Superman going blue. becoming this energy creature in '96, which is just weird. Also,
I do remember something about that. That was awful. Well, you guys mentioned.
Like,
Go ahead.
but at the same time, like Keith, I know you're a fan of Grant Morrison's JLA, which really brought this new generation of DC superheroes together in a way that really made them feel clever and interesting and relevant for the times. I mean, it's interesting because the decade really kind of splits between the early half of the decade, which is a lot about kind of people finding their footing in some ways. These companies trying to understand what they can do with a new approach to things. By the end of the decade, with Morrison's JLA, with Authority and Planetary, the Heroes Return books of Avengers and Iron Man, superhero books really started to become much more assertive and much smarter about what they were delivering, to the point where it really feels like we went from this almost prehistoric era to an era that feels like very similar to the comics we see today, just maybe a slightly proto version of them. And Morrison's JLA is a great example of that. And his remit from the book was, I want to do a JLA that features all the classic characters. Of course, at the time when he took it over, the JLA was completely composed of forgettable nobodies. And it's not insulting to Obsidian and Major Force to say that. And he said, okay, I don't care who's wearing the costumes. I want Green Lantern and the Flash and Wonder Woman and Superman and Batman. So, when Superman became an energy creature, he was Superman the energy creature as a JLA member. When Wonder Woman was temporarily dead, her mom, Hippolyta, became a member. Right. And Morrison rolled with the punches, and it kind of gave the signal like, we may be delivering this new generation of heroes, but you're going to love them just as much as you love the older generation.
Well, we mentioned the Flash a moment or two ago, and I think it's important to mention that in the 90s, DC had a pretty good impact on television. One of my favorite bit of trivia from this 90s edition of the Chronicles was learning that John Wesley Shipp's 1990 costume for the Flash TV show was designed by Dave Stevens, creator of the Rocketeer, which is, I mean, how cool is that? That is just, that was great. But they also did, this was also the decade, now that show only lasted a year, but fascinating. I loved it personally, but it's been great in that the current Flash TV series on the CW incorporates John Wesley Shipp again as a Flash in various different modes, but he keeps popping up, and I love that. But this was also the decade that DC had the groundbreaking Batman the Animated Series, and kind of a hint of what would come 20 years later with DC. They did Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which began that whole idea of, there's other ways to look at these classic shows. There's Krypton, there's Gotham, there's, all these kinds of things. Did the TV shows, though, in the 90s, did they do the comic books any good? The comic book companies? Or was it like just a world apart? Did they not figure out how to connect the two?
Well, Jason, you can feel free to disagree with me, but I would say like the latter. I mean, it almost felt like two distinct worlds. I mean, as the comic book industry is going kaput, the TV, those animated series seem to be thriving. But I mean, you might have a different view on that, Jason.
No, and one of the things I heard over and over from friends when I was writing the book was, I hope you write about the Spider-Man or X-Men or Batman the Animated Series cartoons from the 90s, because people love them. I know the X-Men in particular was like a gateway series for a lot of people. A couple people mentioned the Iron Man and Fantastic Four cartoons that Stan Lee did voiceovers for. People, there was a lot of love for that material, but people weren't finding the comics. In fact, you could say things went one way, and which was finally the comics were becoming more of an influence on the TV series. There's quite a few episodes of Batman the Animated Series based on classic Batman stories, but they didn't really go the opposite way. There were some adaptations of animated series, including some that really never took off, including Wildcats animated series, Ultraverse animated series, Savage Dragon, which appeared on USA Network. There were quite a few attempts to exploit these new properties, but no one really was able to do so well. So we probably need to
start winding up here. I know we've gone a little longer than we planned. Do you guys have a favorite indie publisher? Think about that for a second. I'll tell you mine. I used the book as my reference for this because I knew there were ones that I liked. I liked the Ultraverse, and I liked Prime and Hardcase.
Mm-hmm.
I liked X and Ghost from Dark Horse's Comics Greatest World, and I also liked Milestones, Hardware, Static Shock, and Icon. Any others that you guys particularly liked, or anything you'd like to see come back from that era?
I love the Ultraverse characters too. Really like the Strangers. There's a Sludge from Steve Gerber, whose work I adore. Just love that material. My favorite stuff I rediscovered was the earliest Valiant comics before the Unity crossover. It was just extremely strong, steady storytelling. It's just really good comics. And so, particularly a series called Rai, R-A-I, which Valiant has revived, but not with quite the same spirit. It's actually a really dark, kind of strange sci-fi story that just stands on its own as this very unique creation. I just thought it was very cool.
Keith, anything?
I mean, I'll go back to Hellboy. I mean, Hellboy was my absolute favorite 1990s creation. If you're asking me to name someone other than Mike Mignola, I do... the Danger Unlimited, that John Byrne limited series by Dark Horse Legend. I mean, that's another Dark Horse Legend series. And Frank Miller was really putting out some fun stuff with Sin City and 300 and the things he was doing with Jeff Darrow. So I'll go with that. Martha Washington, the Martha Washington series. Bob's looking he's giving me this blank look like, what are you talking about?
No.
Okay.
I actually, now I'm finding out that you had video on, so I didn't know that. So I didn't know you could see my expression.
Oh, yeah.
No, that wasn't a blank look of that. Actually, the only response I had to that was actually, you said Frank Miller doing fun stuff, and I'm thinking Frank Miller and fun are not really words that go together very well.
Don't always go together.
Death and Destruction, Frank Miller.
Speaking of fun, also, Alan Moore's America's Greatest Comics.
Oh, Tom Strong.
Just a treat. Tom Strong and the early issues of Promethea are just fun, and it gets really interesting and deep philosophical. Top 10 is a great series from him. I'd love to see someone go back to those characters again.
Well, so Jason just held up a special section from Wizard Magazine, which fits in perfectly with one of the last two things I want to ask you guys about, and that is there are two. I want to call them both businessmen. I know they were comics fans first, but they became businessmen in the 90s. Steve Geppi, and Gareb Shamus, who Geppi is Diamond Comics distribution, and Shamus was a publisher of Wizard Magazine. How do these guys, now, of the two of them, Shamus, I think, is pretty much out of the business, but Steve Geppi is still very much a part of it. And at the risk of endangering tomorrow's distribution, how do those two guys, how does their involvement in the 90s comics world, how does it hold up? How are they seen 20 years on?
Jason,
wow, big silence here.
Okay. Well, I mean, we do, the book does... Wizard does become one of the most prominent topics in the volume, right, Jason? That's fair enough to say. I think that becomes the number one news source for comic book collectors, comic book readers in the 1990s, replacing Comics Buyer's Guide, replacing Comics Journal. Unfortunately, it just Wizard, and this is not an opinion, this is an objective fact, that Wizard's coverage just didn't meet the standards of Comics Buyer's Guide or Comics Journal. I mean, it's the controversy is that Wizard was sort of in cahoots with the publishers, and it became sort of a hype machine for the publishers that certainly Comics Journal would never, Comics Journal did not get into bed with publishers.
Yeah, hype machine is a perfect phrase to use for it.
Yeah, I mean, and so I mean that's the controversial legacy of Wizard magazine. There's no question it is one of the most important publications in the history of the comic book industry, but it's a controversial reputation, and
It promoted some weird hot artists, weird hot titles. This issue of Generation X.
yeah.
You probably can't see it because it's so bright.
Mhm.
This was going to send my kids to college. I don't know why it didn't.
But to your point, Jason, is that I mean I can't tell you how many comic book creators, not comic book fans, but comic book creators would tell me that they were convinced that Wizard was flat out manipulating secondary market prices.
It was, yeah. There's no question.
All right, so guys, the last thing I want to ask you about, and you've been very patient, but it turned out this was for a guy who felt like he hadn't read a lot of stuff in the 90s. This brought a lot of stuff back, so I think I probably spent too much time reading comics in the 90s, now that I think about it. The last thing I want to ask you about is in the 70s, DC and Marvel did something unheard of, and they actually crossed over their characters, Spider-Man and Superman and Batman and whomever and blah, 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 blah. In the 90s, we got DC versus Marvel, Marvel versus DC. How did those titles hold up 20 years later? Was it junk? Was it fun? It seemed like it was fun at the time.
So here's my favorite single thing I discovered writing this book. So, there's two things I love, but they amount to the same thing. The comic book world was incredibly driven by fads in the 1990s. Fact number one I loved was in 1993, there were 28 new comics companies or imprints created in 1 year. In 1 year, it was just insanity. But my second favorite fact is between 1996 and 1997, only between two companies, not just the Marvel DC crossover, there were 45 different cross-company crossovers in that 1 year. You had Grifter meeting She, you had Ghost meeting Hellboy, you had Hulk meeting The Pit, Star Trek meeting X-Men, Spider-Man meeting Gen 13. Some of them are fantastic, just so much fun. There's a Gen 13 Fantastic Four crossover drawn by Kevin Maguire. That's just a treat. This is so much fun. And there's some stuff that's just awful. There's I have that here too. I got all my visual aids at my fingertips. X-Force Youngblood crossover, which is just awful, unreadable. I'm sorry, Rob. Here's a few interior pages from it.
Wow.
Not the greatest thing ever, but it's a 90s thing, and I love it for being that.
So, but what about how did the DC versus Marvel, Marvel versus DC, how did that hold up? Was it any good? I have them. I think I still have them in the garage somewhere.
Keep them in the garage.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I wouldn't be rereading those anytime soon. I'm good friends with Ron Mars, and so. But
now we actually tell a story in the book how fans rebelled against them because they were such a disappointment. They hyped like a big battle between Lobo and Wolverine that was done in one page, and the ending was a bit of a letdown.
You don't even see the battle. They go behind a bar, and then Wolverine just emerges. So you don't even see how they fought. I mean, that's clearly because that was one of the vote ones, Wolverine versus Lobo. So Wolverine obviously won the fan vote. But I forget who wrote that section. I forget if it was Ron who wrote that section or Peter David. But I can imagine them either one of them just throwing up their hands and just being like, I don't know how to write this conflict, just make a joke out of it that they fall behind a bar and one of them emerges. It's
for people who
I would agree with Jason. Leave it in the garage.
For people who don't have video, Jason was laughing so much at Keith's representation that he leaned very far back. I thought he was going to fall over in his chair. And it's not a 90s crossover, but I will say this, I think the single greatest comic book crossover I've ever read, I think would be in the last year or two. I can't quite be sure. It was Planet of the Apes and Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, I thought it was the most brilliant thing I have ever read in the history of crossovers. It was a moment in time in the Planet of the Apes series, and I just thought, wow, I wish I had thought of that.
You know what the best crossover of the 1990s, Keith, you'll probably agree with me.
If you're not going to say it, I'm going to say it, so you better say it.
Wildcats versus Aliens.
Oh, I was going to say Punisher Archie.
Oh my God,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
There I go.
Oh,
Back
absolutely.
again.
Yes, Bat and Lash. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Last.
Yeah.
I love
Right,
it.
we're going opposite directions with it because Punisher
Yeah.
Archie is hysterical.
Yes.
Wildcats Aliens is super dark and amazing.
That was
for
Warren
being super-
Ellis, right? And Warren Ellis wrote that?
Yeah, it's
The Aliens
basically the kickstart for the Authority.
Yeah.
Punisher Archie, I think Bat and Lash should be getting some royalties off of the Riverdale series and the Netflix Punisher series because
Yeah, right.
if he hadn't helped make that come to life, I don't think either of those would have been as effective as they are.
Agreed.
And of course, I'm partial. I like Batten. All right.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear he's recovering well.
Me too. I didn't know he was ill, so I'm very glad to hear that he's
Okay.
recovering well.
Yeah. He had a major health setback this year, so
I'm very
he
sorry.
seems to
to
be
hear
doing okay.
that. So, folks, what's the next? Guys, what's the next book in the series?
Is 1940s the first 19? The 1940s, similar to the 1960s, is going to be split between 2 volumes. Kurt Mitchell, with Roy Thomas's guidance, finished that volume, and so the 1940 to 1944 volume is fully written, fully edited, and now it just needs to be designed. And we're thinking that's going to come out like May or June-ish, barring any printing delays or designing setbacks. And then Kurt has already started the second 1940s volume. Bob Hughes, I think, is nearly done with. We don't know what to call it yet. I mean, it's tentatively called the 1930s volume, but it really addresses everything prior to 1940. And that's not a particularly long volume. So John Morrow and I are discussing doing that as a sort of Kickstarter campaign, rather than, say, soliciting that through Diamond. So,
Did you mention you might Kickstarter a reprint of the 1970s book too, Keith?
1980s.
1980s.
Yeah, because the 1980s book is completely sold out, and the pre-orders. I'm trying to get John to really, dive into the Kickstarter waters, because he resolicited the 1980s volume for a second print run. And as Jason and I could both tell you, Bob, these American Comic Chronicle volumes are really expensive to print. I mean, they're hardcover, full color, lots of pages. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. So these are not cheap.
No, they're like the encyclopedias of the comic book world.
Yeah,
right.
They are.
And
288 full color pages with
Yeah.
hundreds of illustrations. There's a lot of work that goes into these. A lot of PLC.
He solicited a second print run of the 1980s volume, and I can't tell you how many people asked, when are you going to reprint the 1980s volume? When are you going to reprint the 1980s volume? And then when the solicitation came out, the pre-orders were something like under 100 or so, or under 200. And John's just like, I can't order a second print run when I'm only getting 200 pre-orders. So, and outside, forget about American Comic Chronicles. I think this is something affecting tomorrow's publications in general, is that, so let's say like George Curry will come out with a book. The pre-orders might not be great, so John orders a somewhat low print run, and then the book sells out in 3 months. And he says, oh, well, if I knew that, I would have doubled the print run. And George is saying, well, thanks. I mean, poor George. And that's why I'm really trying to, he and I are scheduled to have a talk in early January where I want to really get him to dive into the Kickstarter waters. And so, I mean, that's my long-winded way of answering your question, Jason, about, we're thinking of doing a Kickstarter campaign for the second print run of the 1980s volume.
Okay, good to know. I actually have a series I'm thinking of pitching to him, and it's good to know the obstacles he's facing.
Welcome.
See, I'm sorry, Bob, but I mean, Jason, and Kickstarter, I think, becomes a perfect vehicle for like let's say, I mean, I'm not asking you to tell me your idea, but like, let's say you have an idea for John and he's sort of on the fence about it. Kickstarter would be a perfect indication if there is reader support for your idea.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Bob. Oh, is this Bob's show? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, welcome to another episode of Inside Tomorrows.
Yeah.
Right. So the only thing I will say, getting back to kind of the other thing, is I'm not writing a 2000s book. Ain't no way. After spending 4 years on the 1990s book, I'm done with these. 3 books was great. It was a great experience. I loved it.
Yeah. That is not in the works, by the way, just for the record. A volume about the first decade of the 21st century is not in the works for anyone who's interested.
Well, maybe one of John's kids one day will be the publisher of that.
Can I briefly explain why that it's problematic?
Sure.
Okay. So, because you mentioned Wizard Magazine,
mm-hmm.
which, even though it's controversial, it's still a document of essentially comic book publications as it's happening. Same thing with Comic Book Buyer's Guide. Same thing with Comics Journal. That you have in the 70s, you have Comic Reader. You have these various fanzines. What am I blanking out on?
The Fans of Central Jersey newsletter. I know you were going to mention that.
Yeah, things like that. What am I blanking out on, Jason? There's some other fanzines that we used in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah. There
RBCC.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
And even going back to the 60s. And you can pull out these periodicals, these fanzines, and you see the news, being printed on month to month, right, as it's happening. Now, 21st century, how does comic book news get reported? Via Newsarama, via Comic Book Resources, via Bleeding Cool.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go back to those sites? And
in many cases, all that is gone. We were part of their evolution too, Keith.
Yeah, and it's just so the challenge in documenting 21st. I mean, this is almost paradoxical. That the challenge of documenting 21st century comic book history is really, really problematic. I think it was Mike Tiefenberger who used to edit the Comic Reader. I think he made this point in a back issue article, that it really becomes problematic because you don't have Wizard Magazine being published on a monthly basis, and you don't have Comics Buyer's Guide being published on a weekly, monthly basis. Because you're now beholden to the websites, and they don't really have the most user-friendly archive system. You could find an article, say, with Ron Mars from 2002.
Well, there is the WaybackMachine.com and the Internet Research, whatever it's called. All that stuff is archived out there on the web. It can be found, but I understand what you're saying. It's even MrMedia.com, which I've tried very hard to make an easily searched archive, it can be frustrating at times. So I get it.
So it just becomes even, and like Jason just said, is the amount of time it takes to research these volumes, to write these volumes, to polish up these volumes, and now you're adding to that an issue for 21st century comic book. I think John and I have both thrown in the towel on that one, thankfully. I've joked with John Morrow that the series is going to be the death of me, and I was only half joking with him.
All right. Well, listen, folks, you can find the newest installment in the American Comic Book Chronicles series, the 1990s, written by Jason Sachs, edited by Keith Dallas, in great stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. If you are watching the video, go to MrMedia.com and follow these instructions. So below the video on MrMedia.com, you will see the cover of the book. You can click on it. It will take you to Amazon.com. You can order the book right there. You can also order it. I know John Morrow likes people to come to tomorrows.com. It's TWOMORROWS.com. You can go there. You can order the book there.
There's also a free preview of the book that contains about 20 pages on that site. So chance to kind of try before you buy.
Very good. So I gave out the tomorrow's website. Either of you guys have a website you want to tout, or social media site, any of that kind of thing?
So I literally just started a 90s comics Tumblr, which is love90scomics.tumblr.com.
Okay.
So I'll be adding to that, but it's a great place to kind of indulge your 90s comics love.
All right. Keith, anything?
I guess you can look me up on Twitter. Was it Keith_Dallas? I take all types of comments. Fan mail, hate mail. Usually, Jason, on Christmas Eve is when someone complains about American Comic Book Chronicles, and I'm glad this year that was an exception. I did not see any complaints on Christmas Eve about,
Woo!
Usually someone is taking me to task on Christmas. I don't know why they wait till Christmas Eve, but that has been sort of an annual tradition dating back to the first volume.
That's the coal in your stocking.
Yes, it is.
Well, Jason Sachs, Keith Dallas, it was great to have you guys on again. I hope you'll come back and do the show again sometime. Fascinating conversation. I know we went way over time, but thank you both for joining us on Mr. Media.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Turn up the stereo